I've had this story almost a week now. Believe it or not, it was on NPR. And it's a story that's never told about the ghettos in America. So I want to tell you this story about ghettos in America. We hear the liberals talk all the time, right? About we have these segregated communities in the inner cities. We don't use the word ghetto anymore, but ghetto is a perfectly legitimate word, and I will not be censured and told what words we can and cannot use that are in fact legitimate words. Believe it or not, this was on NPR. Historian says don't sanitize how our government created ghettos. He means the modern inner city. 50 years after the repeal of Jim Crow, many African Americans still live in segregated ghettos in the country's metropolitan areas. Richard Rothstein, a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, as far as I know this could be some left-wing Marxist group, doesn't really matter, has spent years studying the history of residential segregation in America. Or it may be a conservative group, again, I don't know. He says we have a myth today that the ghettos in metropolitan areas around the country are what the Supreme Court calls de facto. Just the accident of the fact that people have not enough income to move into middle-class neighborhoods, or because real estate agents steered black and white families to different neighborhoods, or because there was white flight, says Rothstein to NPR. It was not the unintended effort or effect of benign policies, he says. It was an explicit, racially purposeful policy that was pursued at all levels of government. And that's the reason we have these ghettos today, and we are reaping the fruits of those policies, unquote. So let's stop right here. His hypothesis, actually his assertion, based on his years and years of study, is that the government created the modern ghetto. Well, that caught my attention. Does it have your attention? Let's continue. One of the ways in which we forget our history is by sanitizing our language and pretending that these problems don't exist. We've always recognized that there were ghettos. A ghetto is, as he defines it, a neighborhood which is homogeneous and from which there are serious barriers to exit. That's the technical definition of a ghetto. Robert Weaver, the first African-American member of the cabinet appointed by President Johnson as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, described many of the policies that this fellow describes today in a book he published in 1948 called The Negro Ghetto. The Kerner Commission referred to the ghetto. This is a term that we no longer use because we're embarrassed to talk about it. And we need to confront our history, this is the professor, and stop sanitizing our language and talk openly about what we've done as a nation and what we need to do to undo it. He goes on. He goes on and he says, it's a policy. Well, actually, let me do this. He says, and we can't talk openly if we're going to use euphemisms instead of being explicit about what the reality is. On how the New Deal's Public Works Administration led to the creation of segregated ghettos. Let me repeat this. On how the New Deal's Public Works Administration, the PWA, led to the creation of segregated ghettos, he says, its policy was that public housing could be used only to house people of the same race as the neighborhood in which it was located. But in fact, most of the public housing that was built in the early years was built in integrated neighborhoods, which they raised and then built segregated public housing in those neighborhoods. So public housing created racial segregation where none existed before. That was one of the chief policies. Wow. And I thought we were supposed to celebrate FDR and the progressives and the New Deal. On the Federal Housing Administration's overtly racist policies in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, he says the second policy, which was probably even more effective in segregating metropolitan areas, was the Federal Housing Administration. You've heard of the FHA, right? Which financed mass production builders of subdivisions starting in the 30s and then going on into the 40s and 50s, in which those mass production builders, places like Levittown, for example, in Nassau County, New York, and in every metropolitan area in the country, the FHA gave builders like Levitt concessionary loans through banks because they guaranteed loans at lower interest rates for banks, and the developers could use to build these subdivisions on the condition that no homes in those subdivisions be sold to African Americans. Your ears should be ringing. This is New Deal, progressive, federal policy. In the ghettos, government policy, municipal policy, for example, denied adequate services, garbage wasn't collected frequently, African Americans were crowded into neighborhoods in the ghetto because so much other housing was closed to them as a result. Housing prices in ghettos were much higher than similar housing in white areas. Rents were much higher than similar housing in white areas because you had a smaller supply. It's the basic laws of supply and demand. So this created slum conditions. So when African Americans managed to break out of those slums and buy a home in a neighboring area, whites could be persuaded that slum conditions were going to be brought into their neighborhood. So the real estate agents at the time would go into these neighborhoods and try to panic white families into selling their homes cheap to the real estate agents. And they in turn would flip these homes to African Americans at a higher price. This was all started in the 30s under FDR and the New Deal. This was all started for the purpose of taking integrated inner city neighborhoods and creating segregation through federal spending and federal policies, federal bureaucracies, and federal departments. This is the first I heard of this, and I read a hell of a lot and I study a hell of a lot. Is it the first you've heard of this? No, this story is a week old. Has anybody else even discussed it? Has this been on television anywhere, on any cable program? You see, ladies and gentlemen, as we discuss often on this program, you and I, so much about American history that is wonderful is rejected, is twisted, is attacked. And yet so much about American history that is so awful is celebrated. The New Deal did enormous damage to this country. It did enormous damage to our constitutional system. It did enormous damage to private property rights and capitalism. Oh yes, it created Social Security. Social Security today doesn't look like anything it did when it was first created. Same with several of these other programs. But spending as it is, you would assume that some people are going to benefit from it, so that's a given. But that said, the New Deal was not some brilliant idea that got us out of a depression. And we've talked about this before. There was a recession, a bad recession. And because Herbert Hoover, a liberal Republican, oh, well, he had an executive business experience, as I said, a liberal Republican, and Franklin Roosevelt, a liberal Democrat, because the two of them would not allow the market system to actually work, because the Federal Reserve, even at its early life, in its early years, created tight money when it should have just stabilized the dollar. Government brings down the economy, and out of that is born the New Deal, and out of the New Deal is born segregated metropolitan areas as a matter of policy, as a matter of the left's agenda. I keep talking about how the Democrat Party has done so much damage to black people in this country. How the Democrat Party got its strength, its early strength, from slavery, then segregation, then opposition to voting rights, opposition to civil rights. It is important to know the truth that 50 years after the repeal of Jim Crow, many black people still live in segregated ghettos in America, most of our metropolitan areas. So Richard Rothstein, research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, who has studied this more than anybody else, says that the federal government created these ghettos through its housing policies, through its funding policies, through its subsidy policies. It created ghettos in formally integrated neighborhoods. Don't forget it. I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
Good afternoon from the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. You are about to hear an
Pewabi pottery is a mixture of two styles of pottery. Europeans and the indigenous Potawatomi and Ojibwe people who are already in Detroit. The mixture of those two styles is Pewabi pottery.
Stand next to Jamal.
Now, what is this picture? Native Americans here, indigenous people. White folks. This is a white woman and her two kids. That's Lady Marie Calice de Cadillac. Her arrival less than a year after her husband founded Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. So she comes months after him and lives inside of the fort. Marie Therese de Cadillac. Remember, as I said, they were trading with the French, and they were coming to bring some furs, and one of the Frenchmen's dogs attacked one of the Potawatomi, or Ojibwe, one of the Ojibwe. Attacked one of the warriors who were coming in to trade. One of the Frenchmen, their dog bit him, and he kicked the dog. I mean, that's what he's gonna do. The dog like kick the dog, and the French soldier killed the Ojibwe warrior for kicking the dog. Of course, that started a war between the Ojibwe and the French. They killed dozens of Ojibwe because of this. No, this is just there were numerous breakouts that we don't call wars today. That's really what they were between the, so, because in a trade relationship, it's always, the Europeans were always trying to get over. So sometimes the Native Americans would get mad. You may have heard of Pontiac's Rebellion. That was one of those time periods when the indigenous people like, we going all in. And they killed a whole bunch of Europeans, but they lost. Pontiac was not able to defeat the British. In that case, the British. He wasn't able to defeat them. But he killed a bunch of them.
But then not enough.
Not enough, right? Wow. And of course, he ended up being killed himself by a Fox tribesman. They got him drunk and then killed him outside of Salone. February this year.